The Ghost Bride. In a small, picturesque village nestled in the northern mountains of Vietnam, there is a tale that every villager knows, a tale of a bride who never made it to her wedding day. The village is known for its stunning natural beauty, with lush green hills and a calm river running through it, but it is also infamous for its legend of the Si Do Ma, or Ghost Bride. Many years ago, a young woman named Linh was set to marry the love of her life, a man named An. The couple was deeply in love, and the entire village was excited for the grand celebration. However, on the morning of the wedding, tragedy struck. Linh was found dead in her bridal chamber, still dressed in her wedding gown. Her death was sudden and mysterious, with no clear explanation. Some said it was a heart attack, others whispered of foul play, but no one knew for sure. Heartbroken, and was inconsolable, he abandoned the village shortly after Lin's death, and the wedding that was meant to bring joy to the village became a source of sorrow and fear. Linh was buried in her wedding dress, as per tradition, but her spirit was not at rest. Soon after her death, villagers began to report strange occurrences near Lin's grave. Some claimed to hear a woman weeping softly at night, while others swore they saw a figure in a white gown wandering the streets in the early hours of the morning. Over time, the legend of the Ghost Bride grew, and it became common knowledge that Lin's spirit still roamed the village, waiting for the wedding that never happened. One night, a young man named Tuan, who had recently moved to the village, heard the story from his friends. Tuan was a rational man, not one to believe in ghost stories or superstitions. Laughing at the idea, he made a bet with his friends. He would visit Lin's grave at midnight, the time when the ghost bride was said to appear, and prove that there was no such thing as ghosts. Armed with nothing but his phone flashlight and his bravado, Tuan set off toward the village cemetery, unaware of the horror that awaited him. The night was still as Tuan walked through the village, the moon casting a pale glow over the cobbled streets. The village cemetery was located on a small hill just outside the village, surrounded by dense trees that rustled softly in the wind. Tuan's heart pounded as he approached the entrance, but he pushed his fear aside, determined to prove his friends wrong. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself, stepping through the rusted iron gate. "It's just an old story." The cemetery was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft crunch of gravel beneath his feet. His phone's flashlight cast long shadows on the tombstones, making them seem larger and more menacing in the dim light. Despite his earlier confidence, Tuan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Lin's grave was easy to find. It was marked by a large stone cross, and a white silk ribbon, now faded and frayed, still hung from the cross's arm. It was a reminder of the wedding that had never happened, and as Tuan stood in front of the grave, a strange sense of sadness washed over him. He checked his phone. It was nearly midnight. "All right, Ghost Bride, let's see if you're real," Tuan said aloud, his voice echoing in the stillness. He sat down on a nearby bench, intending to wait until the hour passed. For a while, nothing happened. The wind picked up slightly, and Tuan shivered, pulling his jacket closer around him. He checked his phone again. 11:58 p.m. Just 2 more minutes, and he could go back to his friends and laugh at their gullibility. But as the clock struck midnight, something changed. The air around him grew colder, and the wind seemed to stop entirely. A thick fog began to rise from the ground, swirling around the tombstones like a veil. Tuan's breath caught in his throat as he looked around, suddenly feeling very alone. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He turned, and there, standing at the edge of the cemetery, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her long black hair hanging down her back. Her face was obscured by the mist, but her presence was unmistakable. Tuan's heart pounded in his chest. His mouth went dry as he stood frozen, staring at the figure. The woman slowly began to walk toward him, her movements graceful but unnatural, as if she were gliding over the ground. This isn't real," Tuan whispered, but the fear creeping up his spine told him otherwise. The figure came closer, and as she did, Tuan finally saw her face. It was pale, her eyes dark and empty, and her lips twisted into a sorrowful frown. There was something deeply unsettling about her expression, a mixture of sadness and rage. Tuan stumbled backward, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. The woman's eyes locked onto his, and he could hear her soft, mournful voice. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice echoing through the fog. Tuan's legs gave out, and he fell to the ground, scrambling to pick up his phone. His mind raced. Was this really Lin, the ghost bride? He had never believed in spirits, but here she was, standing before him, her presence as real as the fear coursing through his veins. Tuan's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to scramble away from the approaching figure. His rational mind was screaming at him that this couldn't be happening, that it was just some kind of trick or hallucination. But the icy terror gripping his body told him otherwise. The ghost bride came closer, her sad eyes never leaving his. Her white gown, once beautiful and pure, was now dirty and torn, as if it had been dragged through the dirt for years. Her hair, long and tangled, framed her pale, expressionless face. "Why did you leave me?" she repeated, her voice filled with sorrow and accusation. "I didn't leave you," Tuan gasped, barely able to speak. "I am not Anne. I don't even know you." The ghost bride's face twisted in confusion for a moment, as if she were struggling to understand his words. Then her expression changed, and she looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. "I waited for you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I waited for you on our wedding day, but you never came. I was left alone, and now I can never rest." Tuan realized, with a sinking feeling, that she thought he was her lost fiancé, the man who had abandoned her so many years ago. She was trapped in that moment, unable to move on from the pain and betrayal she had felt on the day she died. The sorrow in her voice was overwhelming, and for a moment, Tuan felt a wave of sympathy for her. She wasn't just a vengeful spirit. She was a woman who had been robbed of her future, a bride who had died without ever experiencing the happiness she had been promised. But, as her sorrow deepened, so did the intensity of her presence. The fog around them thickened, and the air grew even colder. The ghost bride's sorrow was turning into something darker, something more dangerous. "You left me," she cried, her voice rising in a wail of despair. "You left me to die alone. Why did you leave me?" The ground beneath Tuan began to tremble, and the tombstones around him seemed to shift and move in the thick fog. He had to get out of there, but the ghost bride was standing between him and the exit. Thinking quickly, Tuan spoke again, his voice shaking but desperate. "I didn't leave you, Lin. I'm here now. Please, let me help you." The ghost bride paused, her expression softening slightly. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might listen to him. But then her eyes filled with anger once more. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's too late. It's too late for me." Her hands reached out toward him, and Tuan felt an icy grip around his wrist. The cold seared through his skin, freezing him to the bone. He struggled to pull away, but her strength was far greater than he had expected. "I just want to rest," she whispered, her voice now full of bitterness. "But I can't. I can't until you pay for what you did to me." Tuan's heart raced as the ghost bride's cold grip tightened around his wrist, her ghostly presence weighing him down. He felt as though he were being dragged into the ground itself, the air around him growing thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. He had to think quickly. There had to be a way to calm her spirit, to make her see that he wasn't the man she thought he was. But how could he reason with a ghost who was trapped in the past, reliving the most painful day of her life over and over again? "Lin, please," Tuan shouted, his voice breaking with fear. "I'm not the one who left you. I'm not Anne. I'm just someone who made a mistake coming here. You have to believe me." For a moment, the ghost bride hesitated. Her hand trembled as she stared at him, confusion flickering across her pale face. The fog around them seemed to still, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Tuan seized the opportunity. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," he continued, his voice softening. "I can't imagine the pain you've gone through, but you don't have to stay here. You don't have to wait anymore. You can find peace." The ghost bride's face softened, her dark eyes filling with sorrow once more. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she might release him, as though his words had reached her. But just as quickly, her expression twisted into one of rage. "Peace," she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "There is no peace for me, not until I have my revenge." The fog surged forward, wrapping around Tuan like icy tendrils. He gasped as the cold closed in, feeling as though he were being smothered by the very air around him. The ghost bride's grip tightened, pulling him closer. "You left me," she screamed, her voice filled with fury. "You left me to die alone, and now you will suffer as I have suffered." Tuan struggled, his body trembling with fear and cold. He couldn't break free from her grip, and the fog was growing thicker, choking him as it pressed against his lungs. He was running out of time. In a final, desperate attempt, Tuan reached into his pocket and pulled out the small jade pendant he always carried with him, a gift from his grandmother, said to bring protection from evil spirits. He had never believed in its power, but now, with no other options, he held it out in front of him, hoping it would be enough. The moment the pendant touched the ghost bride's icy skin, she recoiled, her grip loosening. The fog around them thinned, and for the first time, Tuan saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "No," she cried, backing away from him. "No. This isn't how it's supposed to be." Tuan scrambled to his feet, clutching the pendant tightly in his hand. He didn't know why it had worked, but he wasn't going to question it. He took a step forward, his voice steady, but filled with urgency. "Lin, you can't stay here," he said. "You don't belong in this world anymore. It's time to let go." The ghost bride stared at him, her expression torn between anger and sorrow. Slowly, the fog began to dissipate, and the cold air around them warmed. Her figure, once so solid and terrifying, began to fade. "I waited for so long," she whispered, her voice barely audible now, "but he never came." With those final words, the ghost bride vanished, her spirit finally fading into the night. Tuan stood alone in the cemetery, his heart pounding in his chest. The fog had lifted, and the air was clear once more. He glanced down at the pendant in his hand, grateful for whatever power it had held. As he made his way back to the village, Tuan knew he would never forget what had happened. The ghost bride had finally found peace, but her tragic story would live on in the whispers of the villagers for generations to come.